What's up YouTube? This is Dennis Panuta for tutorials.eu. In this video, you are going to learn how to create a currency converter using C# as well as WPF and XAML. And WPF stands for Windows Presentation Foundation, which is basically the tool that you are going to use in order to create a beautiful user interface, the one that you can see here, or there. And you're going to build it from scratch using XAML, which is a form of XML. And it is basically similar to a language, but it's not really a programming language. And still, you're going to learn how to use it in order to create such a user interface and a lot more. And this is just part 1 of the series. In part 2, you are going to extend that application and make it a database application. So in this video, we are using static data. In the next one, we are going to use database data. So you're going to learn how to use databases in C# and how to enter data using a UI as well. So if you don't want to miss out, and I hope you don't, then hit that subscribe button as well as that notification bell. And while you're at it, also please hit that like button because it really helps out the YouTube algorithm for that video. And I definitely want this to become successful. I hope you understand why. And also, if you have any questions and remarks or ideas for other content, then leave a comment. All right, so let's get started. All right, so let's look at what we're going to build in this video, and we're going to build this using C# and WPF, so the Windows Presentation Foundation, and that will basically allow us to create this currency converter, as you can see here, with images and a beautiful little box in which we can enter values, and then we can convert from one currency to another. And the values that are behind those currencies, so the conversion rates, are going to be static. So we are going to use static values in our program. But in the next video, we are going to look at how we can use a database to get the data from a database. And then there will be a third video in which we're going to look at how we can get the data from the web. So how we can use an API to get that data. Okay, but we're starting with this one here. As you can see, I can convert whatever amount I'm entering here into another currency. So from US dollars to euros. If I do the same thing from Indian rupees to euros, let's do that again. We can see that 1,337 rupees are going to be 15 euros and 72 or 73 cents, something like that. And then I can click clear in order to clear the data and then start from scratch. So let's see how many dollars we get for 420 euros. And we can see we get 476. All right, so let's build this UI with WPF first, and then we're going to add the functionality. So we're going to do that in the code behind, and therefore let's create a new project. And in order for this to work, we need to make one thing sure, that is that we have an individual component. So you go here to individual components installed, and that is the NuGet manager. So you can search for the NuGet package manager. That's the one that we are going to require. Also, for the other parts, you might want to install SQL Server and then ASP.NET. Well, if you want to use ASP.NET, but we're not going to use that here. And yeah, that's going to be for now. So you can launch your Visual Studio community, for example. In my case, it's 2019, but that should work the same way with other versions as well. So you can then just go ahead and create a new project. And here, it's important that you select WPF app.NET framework. So you can search it here and scroll all the way down till you find this WPF.NET framework, because that's going to be the one that we need. So select that template, give it a name. I'm going to call this one currency converter underscore static, because we're going to use static numbers and values for the currency conversion. And then let's just create the project. And by the way, if you want to follow along a step-by-step guide, including the code and all of that, you can click the link in the description. There you will find the link to this blog article that we created. It includes all of the code and a bunch of screenshots and a very nice step-by-step guide that you can also follow along while watching the video as well. Once the project is ready, you will see that you have a main window.xaml and a main window.xaml CS file opened, and you have the code behind that is this CS file. This is this C# code that you should be aware of, or you should know how to read all of that, because you should have at least understood the basics of C#. And then the XAML part, which is the WPF part, so to speak, so the Windows Presentation Foundation, which is basically an XML type of language. So we are going to use XML in order to create our UI. So whatever stands here is going to be translated into a UI, and basically we want to rebuild the UI that you have seen at the beginning of the video. Now, if you want to see what else you have in your project, you can just open up your Solution Explorer. You will see that you have this app config file, which is also XML, which basically can be changed per your requirements. So the administrator can control which protected resources an application can access, which version of assemblies an application will use, the connection string, for example, for databases, which we are going to see later on. But basically, that's the app.config file. Then you have the app.xaml file. You can also add application resources. So the app.xaml file is the place to subscribe to essential application events like application start, then unhandled exceptions, and so forth. It is the declarative starting point of your application, and the code behind is called app.xaml.cs. So this is basically the code behind, so your C# code, in which you can add the logic to your project. But we are going to use the main window code behind to do the main window logic, because basically we want to run our code inside of our main window and execute some good logic there. So let's go to our main window XAML file. What you can see is that we have a certain height and a certain width, which is created for us by default. So if you run this application now, you will see an empty screen that will appear, or an empty window which has this height and width. So a height of 450 pixels and a width of 800 pixels, as you can see here. And yeah, that's basically our application. And now, quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. You could, of course, go ahead and drag stuff to it. So from the toolbox, you could go ahead and drag, for example, a button in there, and you can run the application once again, and you will see that now there is a button. So this button doesn't do anything, but as you can see, it's inside of your grid, and it has a content which says button. You could change that to hello, and then if you look at it here at the top, you can see that this button now says hello instead of button. Then there are some properties assigned to it, for example, the alignment, so it's horizontally aligned towards the left, and you have certain margins. So for example, towards the left hand side 388 pixels, towards the top we have 116 pixels, and if I drag this button around, you can see that those values will change. It's vertically aligned towards the top, and it has a width of 75, so you could change that anytime to, let's say, for example, 100 pixels, and it would be a wider button. Okay, but yeah, I'm not going to do it this way because, well, I could, of course, drag and drop stuff in there, but I really like to code my UI because it gives me a lot more control over the UI itself. But as I said, you could, of course, open the toolbox and just see what kind of WPF controls you have. So these are the common ones here at the top, such as pointer, border, button, checkboxes, images, and so forth. And then you have all WPF controls, and you can see there are a bunch more that you can use in your WPF project. And you can also see what kind of properties are automatically assigned once you drag such an element into your project. So for example, if I drag a label in, you can see that it has this content property, again, the horizontal alignment, the margin, as well as the vertical alignment. So there are a bunch of different options. Of course, there are plenty more properties that you can change. You can just enter an empty space here and you can see that it gives you some properties that you can directly change. And it's not just properties, but you can also have certain commands here that you can execute, some events that are in there as well, context menu opening, context menu closing, and so forth. So a bunch of different properties. You can just use them and play around with them to see what they do and all of that. But of course, we are going to look at the most important ones that we are going to require for this particular application. All right, so let's get started. First of all, I'm going to change some things up. So I'm going to change the title of this window. And let me close it here. I'm going to change it from main window. As you can see here at the top, it says main window, to currency converter. And I'm going to size it. So size to content. I'm going to say it should be width and height. And the window startup location should be center owner. So you can also center screen if you want to always open this at the center of the screen. So let's just test this and let's run the application, and you will see that it opens up directly in the center of the screen, even though, as you can see, there's no content whatsoever in here. And now, because of this size to content width and height, well, as we have no content, it's so small, even though I have defined a height and width here. So you can see that there are properties which can override other properties. Even though I have hard-coded the height and width here, this size to content has basically overridden it, and now our compiler ignores this height and width that I have defined here. So if I get rid of this again and run it again, you will see that it will be back at this height and width. But if you only want it to be as big as the content inside of it, you can use this size to content width and height, okay? Because, well, I don't have any content in there, but as soon as I do have content in there, I want to make sure that my application is displaying the window in the right size, and it doesn't look weird because of some predefined values that I have at the top level of my application, of my window in this case. It's not really the application, but it's specifically this window, because you can see we are inside of the window in which we have a bunch of XML namespaces which we use. So they basically allow us to use all of those properties and the functionality that you have seen. So these are namespaces that we can use for our program. And then we have this grid, and a grid has rows and columns. And now we're going to use rows and columns here. And in order to use rows, you need to add row definitions. Okay, so let me just paste in some row definitions that I have prepared here. So here, grid row definition, and I say the first row should have a height of 60, second one of 80, third of 150, fourth of 100, and fifth of 150. So if you check it out here, you can see that we now have all of those rows. Okay, we don't have a width yet, but we have a height for each of those rows. So now a row can have columns, okay? And we can define what we want to have inside of such a column. All right, so now inside of this grid, here at the bottom, I would like to add content. And I'm going to start with a border. So I'm going to add a border here, and you can see I created this border which creates this reddish background color, and some things are happening in there. So let me go over it step by step. So let me just create this rectangle first. So I'm creating a rectangle inside of this border. So I'm creating a new element inside of my UI, which is a border, and I position it at the grid row 2. So you can see this is grid row 0, this is grid row 1, and this 150 here is grid row 2, which is this one. So we have these row definitions, and this one is 0, 1, 2. So now in 2, I'm adding this border here. And I say it should have a width of 800 and it should have a corner radius of 10 as well as a border thickness of 5. So the border is 5 pixels thick. And then I have this rectangle inside of our grid row 2, which basically is filled with a color. So this is how you can see this reddish color here. But it's not just red color, but it's this linear gradient brush. So I'm just saying I would like to have this gradient color here. And in order to use a gradient color, you use this linear gradient brush class. And you have a starting point, which is at 0, 0, and an ending point, which is at 1, 0. So basically saying at the very right hand side. So the 0, 0 is at the very left side, and this 1, 0 is at the very right hand side. So at the most right point inside of the element that we are inside of, which is inside of this rectangle. Okay, and then I have 2 gradient stops here. That's how you can create such a gradient. So I have a gradient stop, which is the first one, which is the start point. So this is pinkish color, which has this hexadecimal color value of EC2075. And I don't want to have an offset here. So what is an offset? Well, if you want to know such a thing, then you can always check out the documentation. So you can see there is this class called gradient stop, and there is this property called offset, and gets the location of the gradient stop with the gradient vector. So it is a double, and it says it's the relative location of this gradient stop along the gradient vector. The default value is 0, 0. So if you want to know more about every single property that I'm using, you can always check out the documentation. So here you see I'm using the offset property inside of the gradient stop class. So let's look at it, and let's go back to our main.xaml here. You can see I'm inside of gradient stop and I'm referring to the offset property. If I want to know more about this endpoint or the start point, I can also go to the documentation and I can search for endpoint. And then you can see that there are different endpoints that you can work with. And the specific one that I'm looking at is the linear gradient brush. So you can go to linear gradient brush. And then you have the linear gradient brush classes here. As you can see, there are different ones. So for example, this class in drawing 2D and then the one in windows.media. So these are 2 different classes with the same name. So the second one inside of windows.media is the one that we are using, as you can see here, because it has this field called endpoint property and start point property. And it has these properties called endpoint and start point. So these are the ones that we are working with. So if you want to know more about the start point, for example, you can just click on linear gradient brush start point property, and then you will find out more of it. You can see here, this is the start point and this is the end point. If it's 1, 1, because I took 1, 0, it will be at the top right hand side. And yeah, basically this is how you can find out more about all of those properties, because I'm going to rush through many of them, otherwise this video will take forever. Okay, so we have this gradient stop, which is basically what we want to have at the end point, and it will be this red color. So I'm creating this gradient here. Okay, but as we saw earlier, it wasn't just this rectangle that I had, but I also had a border here. So I want to add that border back. So let me add the border brush back to it, which is going to be this border brush. So now we have this slightly rounded border here on the sides. You can barely see it, but well, basically we created a new border here, and this creates this very special design here. So you can see you have a bunch of freedom when it comes to adjusting your UI. Okay, so I have this rectangle, and then I'm using a border brush. And again, you could of course check out border brush here. So border brush to get to learn more about the different settings and in general, everything that you need to know about it in the documentation. Now you might say, wow, this is a lot of work just to get this square in there. Well, Of course, the square could have been simpler. I didn't have to use a brush. I just could have used a color here, but I wanted to make it look a little better and follow the color theme of my design of my website. Okay, so then I would like to have a bunch more content inside of it. And I'm just going to use a bunch of stack panels. Okay, so let's look at what a stack panel is. Therefore, I'm just going to create a new stack panel. All right, and inside of this stack panel, I would like to have a label. Okay, so let's add the content of the label. And let's say the content should be hello world. All right, if I do that, you can see that here at the top left hand side, we have hello world inside of this label, inside of this stack panel label. What I can do, of course, is I can say that it should be, for example, centered, or I could assign a certain width to it and all of that. So I can do that on multiple levels. For example, on the stack panel level itself, I can say that the stack panel should take the whole width available, or basically the whole width that we are also using here for our border already. And actually the border is at 800. We could make it even wider, because then this red part would look even better, because then it would get some margins and all of that. So you can, of course, add margins on the level of the border itself. So I could go ahead and say add a margin of, for example, 10 pixels. So now we have a margin towards all directions. But I can also manipulate this UI to do it via the stack panel. So I could just say the stack panel should have a width of 1000. So now suddenly we have enough space towards the side, because the stack panel itself takes a lot of space. It's very wide. I can also define a certain height for it. I can just say, okay, it should have the height of, let's say, 50 pixels. So you can see that it is less than the available space, because the available space is 60 pixels. Why is that? Well, because we defined that in that row definition. So how does that stack panel know that it is in the first row? We never told it. Well, that's because by default, it just takes the first one that's available. But we can, of course, define it specifically. So I could just say the grid row should be, for example, 0. Or I could say it should be 3. So now you see it positions it in the 3 grid row, in the 4th grid row, so to speak. Or I could put it at 4. You can see, so I have a bunch of flexibility, and at the same time I can force it to go to a specific position in my row. Okay, so I'm going to put it at the top. I'm going to have the width of 1000, pretty wide content here. And I'm going to say that the orientation of whatever is inside of my stack panel should be horizontal. Okay, so let's do that. And now let's copy that label and put it in there twice. So you can see now we have two labels, and they are stacked next to each other. Why are they next to each other? Well, because I set the orientation to be horizontal. Now let's make it vertical instead. You'll see that now those two elements are put on top of each other, because the orientation for that stack panel, which stacks elements that are inside of it on top or next to each other, depending on the orientation that you define here. And that's exactly what happens. But because I want it to be horizontally, I'm just going to use horizontal here as the orientation. And actually, I don't even need a second label. I'm just going to stay with one label. All right, now the content says hello world, but it should actually say currency converter, because that's what this program is all about. So currency converter. And now I can go ahead and give it a little more details. So I want to make the width of the label 100%, which is in our case 1000. So now you can see it takes the whole width, and the text is not centered. This currency converter text is not centered. How do I center it? Well, I can use something called horizontal content alignment, because I want to align the content horizontally towards the center. So I set this property called horizontal content alignment to the value of center. And now I can do the same thing for the vertical content alignment, I can also set that to be centered, because now you can see the text is now centered. It's pretty small, but basically now I centered the text. And if I don't do that, you can see that it will go towards the top here by default. Okay. If I enter center here, however, then it will center the text. Okay, so let's look at the other properties that are relevant here. For example, how about a font size? So let's use 25, for example. You can see the text is significantly larger. And I would like to use the same color that we have used before, which is this pink color. Okay, so I'm going to assign that color, but unfortunately it doesn't accept the property color for label. Why is that? Well, because label has its own way of handling colors, and that is to use foreground. Okay, so there's this property called foreground, and if I assign that, now I can assign a color to it, and you can see now the text has this color that I wanted, this pink color. All right, and that is how you can add stack panels inside of a row and basically define UI elements in it, change the properties around, and you could now play around with whatever element you want to have in there. So you could even drag it from here. So for example, you can take a checkbox and you can drag it in here, and you can see now it's currently automatically, you see, inside of our grid number 2, or actually number 1. Let's see, grid row, and this one in the 81, it's automatically in there. You can see because it just has this 33 pixel margin towards the top of this particular row. Okay, so I will, however, use stack panels. So basically, stack panels are containers, which in our case are inside of the container of a grid row, which is again inside of our window. So I'm going to use a bunch of stack panels here. So let me just paste them in here, because otherwise, well, it would take forever for me to add all of those lines in here. So let me do that real quick. And let's look at them. You can, of course, find the code, as I said, on my website. And so this was this currency converter stack panel that we had before, and everything underneath it was added. So you can see I have this stack panel with a content of converted currency. Okay, and as you see, once I want to see a prediction of how my UI will look like, I get this invalid markup. So as it seems, I have an error in my code that I need to fix first. How do I fix an error? Well, first of all, I need to see where the error is, and beautifully enough, or luckily enough, it displays it here. So it says FA image awesome has not been found. So the type was not found. Verify that you're not missing an assembly reference and that all referenced assemblies have been built. So as it seems, we are missing an assembly. And in this case, it's the font awesome assembly that we're missing. And in order to add this font awesome, what we need to do is we need to manage NuGet packages. So now you might recall why we needed that. So you need to open up the Solution Explorer. You can go to View, Solution Explorer, or press Ctrl-Alt-L if you're on Windows. And then click on the project. Here you can also go on this level. I'm just going to manage NuGet packages here. And then you can browse for font awesome. And you will find this font awesome WPF by Cherry, and you can install this for this particular project. Okay, so I'm going to install font awesome here, and now after a while it will be installed. It opens up this new GitHub window, and well, I still have errors. FA is not defined, so inside of my main window XAML, not all is good yet, but at least this font awesome error should disappear soon. So let me save my project. And now once you have added this NuGet, you need to add the namespace. So you go to show potential fixes here, and it will say add this namespace called schemas fontawesome.io icons. Okay, and now let's scroll all the way up. You will see that it will have added this new namespace for us, which is this one here. So XML NS, so XML namespace FA, which is schemas font awesome IO icons. Okay, so let me scroll out a little bit and you can see that at least this problem disappeared, and now we can see something in our application again. So you can see that this is the UI that we now created with all of those different stack panels. And I'm going to go over those stack panels to show you explicitly what is happening and what we are doing here in code. Okay, now let's fix the other issues that we have here. So let me scroll through it and see what else I have here. And I changed the format up a little bit so I can read it a little better here. So I can see that it says the style that I'm using, static resource button round, does not exist. So what I wanted is I wanted to have rounded buttons. And in order to get rounded buttons, there are multiple ways, and I'm going to show you one way to get around this issue. So let's say a designer gives you the design material and now you need to make your application look exactly the same. And there you can't just tell him, oh, well, I don't know how to do that in code, or I don't know how to do that in WPF. I can't create this UI. Why don't we use squared buttons? Because it's so much easier. Well, that might be okay for your designer, but maybe not for the customer. So definitely you will need to understand how to create rounded buttons, or in general how to adjust the UI so that it looks like you want it. So let's fix this style error real quick. And in order to do that, we need to go to our app.xaml file and we can add application resources to it. So here I'm going to add those lines of code here. So I'm adding a style called button round, and the target type, so the UI element type that I want to target with this is called button, because I want buttons to look differently, because this is the UI element that I want to change. And you can see by adding this code, now I have rounded buttons, and we can see it better if I zoom in a little. You can see now the buttons are rounded. But now let's look at this a little more here. So we are setting something. What are we setting? Well, we're setting the property template, and we set a specific value, and we set the control template, which is the target type again here being button. And what we want to have in there is a border. So we say we want to have a corner radius of 5, and the background should be template binding background. What this template binding does is it links the value of a property in a control template to be the value of another property on the templated control. So you can see it uses this template binding here for a source property. That's exactly what we do. We want to change the background. So here, background of our border, and we say the border thickness should be 0.5, and looking back at our app.xaml, we say that the content should be horizontally aligned towards the center and vertically aligned towards the center as well. So that's what we want to have for the border. So again, you can check out the content presenter. It displays the content of a content control. Now the thing is, this particular part where we set the value and we have a setter here, honestly, it's a little bit too complex for a beginner to fully grasp, or at least it's a concept that is a little more advanced in the WPF space. So if you want to know really specifically how this works, definitely check out my complete C# masterclass. You can find the link in the description below. There I'll go into this in depth, but I really want to move forward with the application, because otherwise this would be a 2-hour course, which I really didn't want this to become. So let's go back to our main window and let's just accept that this basically allows us to make a button rounded. Okay, and there are, as I said, multiple different ways to do that. We could have done a lot of the code directly here in our main window XAML, but This now allows us to basically make all of our button rounded by using this key called button round for the specific buttons that we want to use. So here we just say we want to use a style for that button, and that will be static resource button round. So now we can just use that same style for any button that we have in our application, and we will make that button rounded as well. So now I basically said that my button should be rounded with this app.xaml, so I defined it this way. Okay. So let's look at all of the stack panels here. So let me zoom out a little bit, because I'm going to go through what we have here in terms of code and what it does with our UI, because this is the UI that I wanted to have. And as you can see, I have it now based on all of my XAML code here. So we had this row which created this background basically here. So this border that we have, right? This reddish or this purple red border or pink red border that we have here. And then we have a stack panel here in row 0, which is our currency converter text. Then we have another stack panel, which is basically this converted currency text. And you can see that it's in row 1 and the grid row 1. The rest is the same as it was with the other label. But then we have not only one label, which is this one with a font size of 20 and the default color of black, but we have another label here as well. And the stack panel is oriented vertically. So now we will have two labels which are on top of each other. So this one label, this converted currency label, is just text. And this other label that I have here has a name. So I have defined a name here called LBL currency, which stands for label currency. And now I can access this LBL currency via my code. So let's do that real quick. Let's go to our main window.xaml file. And you can see here that we have a namespace, and then we have this public partial class. So it's just partial because it consists of multiple parts, multiple files, so to speak. So it consists basically of the XAML file as well as this main window file. So we have two physical files which combined create one class. And that's why it's partial. And then we have this main window, public main window, which is the starting point of our main window. So this is where the code starts, so to speak. And first of all, it initializes all of the components inside of our main window.xaml file. So basically it tries to display what we can see in here. So now let me run some code here directly and access this LBL currency. And you can see I can now change properties of it. So I could have created this whole UI in code behind, so in CS code. But the idea behind splitting this up is that you can have a specialist who creates the UI in XAML. And then you have the specialist who creates the logic in code behind, so in C# code. It doesn't have to be the same person. It can, of course, be the same person, but you could have specialists who take care of the different aspects of your application. And now I can access this LBL currency and change its value. So for example, I can change its content to be hello world. Okay, now let's run our application and see if it actually will display hello world. And we still have build errors because, well, it complains that there are certain click methods and event methods that I'm using which are not existing yet. Okay, let's take care of those. So before we run the application, and the point that I try to make is going to be clearer, let's take care of the methods that are still missing. So for example, when you click a button, an event is triggered. And in order for that event to execute something, well, you need to implement it, or you need to at least have the button functionality. So this event inside of your main XAML CS. You can see there is only this main window function. Now, if I click on this convert click, double click on it. Now, if I double click on this convert click and right click and then basically go to definition. So I click to go to definition. What it does is it basically creates this definition for me. So now there is this method. So this is our convert click method, which is a private method. It needs a sender, which is basically the button that you click on. And then you have the rooted event argument, so the events will be then executed. So here what you can do is you can run some code. So let's just do it very simple. Let's click on convert click and now change the text of our LBL currency to hello button clicker. Okay, but that's just one of the buttons that we have. We also have this clear button, and it also has a functionality here. So let's go to that definition as well, and you will see that it will be created for us as well. And then we have this source that I don't have yet. So let me add this source to my project as well. And I'm going to create an images folder in my project. So here inside of my currency converter, let me create a new folder, which I'm going to call images. And inside of images, let's go to the File Explorer to see this images folder. Here I'm going to drag in my image. So I have this particular logo PNG, which is my Tutorials EU logo that you can see here, and I want to use it in my project. Okay, so now I will have this images logo in here, and let me see. Let's add an existing item, which will be all files. Let's add this logo to my project, and now you can see the error disappears and our project accepts this. And then I have something else here. So I have this preview text input number validation text box. Let me go to definition, and that will also create a definition for me. So this is a method. You could have created this method manually as well, of course, and then you could have assigned it here directly. So preview text input, you could have done it this way as well, but I kept it super simple. I was lazy, and that's how I did it. Okay. Now let me run the application again, and now at this time it actually works. So you could see the text was defined when we executed our program to be hello world. Now let's click this convert button, and you can see it says hello button clicker. And why is that? Well, because if we look at it, here we accessed lblcurrency.content and said hello world, and that was when we started the application in our main window method. And then we have this convert click button functionality, and we said that our LB currency content should be changed to hello button clicker. Now you can of course say once we click on clear, we will make the text go empty, go brr. So let's make it go empty. LBL content says hello world, convert, clear. You can see now clear clears it, convert does, well, what we have defined, it sets the content to be something. So you can now see that you have control over UI using the code behind. So this main window, the XAML.ces file, which is the code behind file. And you can now play around with it. Now you can play around with UI elements that you gave a name via code behind. So that's what we did by going here. We have this label. Where is it? It's this label here. Let me just click on it, and then we can see that it's this LBL currency label. So it has a name, and now I can go ahead and basically change its content programmatically. And I want to change the content programmatically because I want to get the value that the user entered here, and then I want to know which currency he wants to convert to another currency, and then we click on the button convert, and then it should change this label's text to be the result of however much will be the value of the other currency. Okay, so I jumped around a little bit. Let's go back to the stack panels and look at them. So we have this stack panel here, which is in our grid row 2, which is the same as our box. Okay, so we created this border here before, which created this red box that we have here. And in there, I have actually 3 labels in the grid row 2. And the stack panel is oriented horizontally, so elements are next to each other. And then I have this horizontal alignment, it's centered, and I have the label number 1, which is basically this enter amount content. As you can see here, it has a certain margin. I say I want to have a certain distance towards the left-hand side of 35. That's what this 35 is. And then I have another label here with a margin of 110. And the last label, which is this one, with a margin of 130. So they have a certain distance to each other. And basically these are the 3 labels. So here this enter amount, from, and to. And then I have another stack panel, which is also in grid row 2, which is also horizontally aligned. And it has a height of 90 and a width of 800. And it's basically those 3 elements that I have here. So it's a text box. A text box is a box in which you can enter text. And I gave it a name because I want to be able to get the value that the user entered from this text box to then use it in my program. So I get text from text currency, which is the name that I gave this text box, txt currency. I give it a certain width of 200, a height of 30, a little bit of a margin, which means it has some space towards the left-hand side, which is this 40. So if I set that to 0, for example, you can see it goes all the way to the left. So that's what this margin 40 does. If I wanted to have a margin towards other directions, for example, towards the top, I would add it as a second value. And if I want to have it towards the right-hand side, you can see here, I would use the 3rd value. And if I want to have it for the bottom, you can see I would use the last value. But as you can see, it doesn't fit into the UI anymore, so it disappears basically. So you have to be very careful with this, these values that you're playing around with. So preview text input should be number validation text box. So what this does is basically when somebody enters something, we want him to be limited to only enter numbers. So that's why we created this function called number validation text box. So what is this number validation text box? Well, it's this function that we will need to implement later on. And you can see that we have this text composition event args, which will be triggered and will give us information about what the user has entered in terms of text. And we can filter out keystrokes that are not numbers, basically. Okay. And then vertical content alignment, well, it's centered. The vertical alignment is towards the top, and that's basically our text box. And then I have this combo box. And this combo box, it allows me to now select out of multiple different values. Okay, so what are the values that I want to allow it to have? Well, that's something that I'm going to define in code behind. So which I'm going to define in the core logic behind it. So I have this name called CMB currency or CMB from currency. And I can now access CMB from currency here. And now I can give it an item source, which will be very important because it needs to know what it can display. And we're going to cover that in a bit. But let's first finish our main window example. So that's a combo box, right? And we're going to look into that in a minute. Then I have this image awesome, and that's basically just this icon that I'm using here, which is this convert icon. That's the idea behind it. And that's why we even needed this font awesome that we have implemented earlier by using the new manage new get packages. Okay, so that's what we needed this font awesome for. And then I have another combo box which allows me to select from multiple values. Okay, you can see each of those has certain properties that we're using, and of course there are a bunch more properties that we could use, but I'm limiting it to the ones that you can see here. So max drop down height, I say okay, it shouldn't drop down to infinity, but it should be just 150 pixels high. Okay, and that is the other stack panel that we have here. And then the next one that we have are the two buttons. So we have another stack panel in grid row 3. It has a height of 100, a width of 1000. It's horizontally oriented, which means elements are going to be next to each other. So not on top, but next to each other. And what do we have in there? Well, we have a button number 1 and a button number 2 in that stack panel. Okay, now we have this button here and we gave it a name. I'm going to call this button convert, even though maybe something like btn convert would be a better name for it. So always try to use good names for it. Then we have a height, a width, and the content, which means the text that is going to be displayed for this button, is going to be convert. And then there's this click property, and that is going to be triggered once we click on the button. And as you can see here, it says convert click will be executed. Now you could of course implement another method. So let me create another method here by hand, which I'm going to call click or my click event. And you need to have an object sender here, and you need to have rooted event args also when you want to use this. Okay, so I have this my click event now, and now I could go ahead and go back to my click event and select my click event here. Okay, so now instead of the event that we had before, which was this convert click event that we generated automatically more or less, I have my own method. Okay, so you can create your own methods and you can just say, okay, call this method, but you have to be careful. It needs a sender of type object and it needs a rooted event args for it to work. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this method because we're not really using it. And I'm going to get back to the convert click here. And by the way, if you're in an empty area, you can use control empty space and then it will offer you whatever makes sense in that context. So in this context, I could create a new event handler. Let's do that real quick. Double click on it. You can see it created this convert click one, and now it created this convert click one method for me. Okay, so this is another way to create such a method. So I'm going to get rid of it because I have this convert click method that we created before. So basically it will give it the name of the button underscore and then click. That will be the name of this click event. Okay, then we have this margin, we have the foreground, which is white in this case. So we have white text basically, we have font size of 20. And then that's the style that we had before, where I say, okay, I want to have a specific style. And now you can, of course, go ahead and give this button a background. So you can see, you can say background, and then you can make this background Alice Blue, for example. Okay, but why is the background of this button not Alice Blue? Well, because I'm overwriting it with this code here. So let me get rid of this code. You can see now it is going to be Alice Blue. So you can overwrite a functionality with a little more complex, let's say, coloring in this case, or a little more complex details by using this approach here, where you say button dot and then whatever property you want to change, and then however you want to change it. So I'm doing it here with the linear gradient brush once again, as I have done with my box or my border before. So I said border brush and then I set the color like this. I could have done border brush here directly as well and select one of those colors. So for example, aqua in this case. So let's use aqua. Let's get rid of border brush, and you can see now we have this border which has the color aqua. But because I wanted the color to be a very specific, which means I wanted to have a gradient, I needed to use this approach here. Okay, so that's what you can do. You have a lot of flexibility in XAML, a lot of power, and that is the cool thing about XAML and WPF in general. You have a lot of freedom to create a UI however you want it. Okay, so that's button number 2, which is this clear button basically. And then we have finally a last stack panel here at the bottom, which is in row 4, which just holds my logo here, which is this image, where I say it has a height of 150, a width of 150. The source is /images/logo.png, which is this images logo.png file. As you saw earlier, I created an extra folder for it, and I created I added the image to that folder, but I still needed to add that item as an existing item for it to appear. And once I did that, then it appeared and I could use, and you have to be careful, I could use this logo.png. Okay, and again, the image is centered vertically as well as horizontally, and it has a certain margin towards the left-hand side of 325 pixels. And that margin is, well, 325 and 0. Okay, so that is the UI. Okay, mind blowing, yeah? And I hope you're fine with me not having entered everything manually, but I explained every single part here, I think. And if you want to know a lot more in depth what's going on here, really understanding what is happening here, and basically also what is happening here with the setters and setting the values and so forth, definitely check out my complete C# masterclass where I go in depth about WPF concepts in general. And this is really just an example of a project that we can build. Okay, then let's go to the logic. And I hope I haven't lost you yet. But I mean, if you're making it this far, you probably make it till the end. And thank you very much for still being with me. And by the way, if you're made it this far, definitely hit that like button and also subscribe to the channel. All right, now let's go to the logic. So as you've seen earlier, we can add a logic directly in our code behind file, which is this CS file. And in the main window is where everything starts. And well, basically what I'm going to add is a bunch of code to my main window, but I'm going to also have to implement those methods a little more because right now they look pretty empty. Okay, so what I need is I need to bind values to my combo boxes. Okay, so I have these combo boxes here, this one and this one, where the user can select a value from. Okay, so you click on it and it displays you the different values, and then you can select one of those, and basically they will be defined as the sitting active value for that combo box. So in order to use it, I need to make sure that I'm binding a value to it. So I'm going to create this method, which I'm going to call bind currency. Okay, so this is the new method that we're using here, bind currency, and it doesn't return anything here, so it's void. So in here, I'm going to use a data table. So I'm going to create a new data table, which I'm going to call data table currency, which will be a new data table object. Okay, so in case data table doesn't appear for you, make sure that you have system data here at the very top using system.data, otherwise it won't work. So you need to have this namespace there. And now this data table is going to be the data source that I want to, or the item source that I want to define for my combo box from currency. Okay, that will make sense in a second. So when you create a data table, you can add columns to it. So I'm going to add a column to this DT currency. So columns.add, and the first one will be called text. And then DT currency columns.add, and the second column will be a value. Okay, so basically I'm creating a table here, and that table has two columns. And the rows that will be in there is what I'm going to add now. So I'm going to add a bunch of rows that should be inside of that data table. So the first one should be select, and select has the text of select and the value of 0. So then the second row that I enter is going to have Indian rupees as the value of 1, then US dollars as 75, euro as 85, and then this pound. I'm not sure what pound it was when I decided to add that there, but it's definitely not British pound. So you can see we have different values here, or different currencies. Now you could of course go ahead and use very different currencies here and define US dollars as 1, and then make sure that you're using the other currencies as, for example, or in my case it would be euros as 1, and the US dollars is at 119, for example. So whatever the current currency exchange rate is, you would add that here. Okay, so I'm using 0 for this one because, well, basically the select is a default value where the user is displayed that he can select something, and 0 would just multiply with 0. Okay, so what I can do now is I can go ahead and say that the combo box that we have, CMB from currency should use this data table as the item source. Okay, so items source should be dt currency dot default view. So by doing that, you assign this data table to be the item source for our CMB currency. Okay, so let me call this bind currency here inside of my main window for this to be executed, because otherwise it will never be executed and it just won't do anything. Now, by the way, you need to also make sure that you add another line here which says display member path. So what should it display? Well, it should display the text, and then you need to define what should be the value. So what should be the underlying value for that particular combo box, and that should be the value path, should be our value column. Okay, so selected value path should be value, and then finally you can say what the default select index is for your CMB from currency. So the selected index will be 0. Let me run that real quick and that will make a little more sense. So you can see now we have this select here, and once I click on it, you can see I have these different names. So this different text that is in my column text here. And it is this because that's what I defined here as the display member path. It should display the text. And what value should be behind it? Well, it should be the value, and that will be whatever value we have here, because that's the second column. If I had a third column, let me just show you real quick. Let's say I had the third column, and I called this column temperature, okay, just as an example. Then I would have to add another value here. So let's say in Indian rupees, it's set to 1 and the temperature is going to be 35 degrees. So even though it doesn't really make sense, but that's how it would work technically, okay? All right, so that is basically what I have here, and you see the selected index is 0, which means it's going to be the select here. If I set it to 1, let me run it again, then it will be automatically set to I and R, so to Indian rupee instead of select. Okay, so that's basically what you have here, is basically the starting default value of your combo box. Okay, and now let's do the same thing for our other combo box. So what is the other combo box that Dennis here is talking about? Well, it's this one here. Where is it? Let's just click on it here, this combo box. And what's the name of the combo box? It's called CMB to currency. So you could have called it however you wanted, right? This name is free to you, but I called it CMB to currency. So how do I access it? Well, with CMB to currency. And now I need to also give it an item source. So I'm going to set the item source to be also dt currency dot default view, because it should use the same data source or data table as the item source, and so forth. Okay, so I also need to assign the display member path, as well as the selected value path, as well as the selected index. Okay, so now it's done for the different combo boxes that we have here. Now, what should happen once I click on this convert click? Of course, I don't just want to display hello button clicker. I want to display something more complex. I want to display some useful values here. So let me just copy the code here, because otherwise it's going to take forever for me to type all of that in. Okay, so when I click on this button, first of all, I want to have a double variable called converted value. Then I'm checking if the text currency text is null or the text currency text is empty. It should display a message box saying please enter currency, and then information. Then we have the OK button, as well as the message box information, and the focus should be set to text currency. and return. So let's just try that. Okay, what is this message box that happens to appear here? Well, let me click on convert. Well, it didn't implement it yet. Now let's just run this code and test it. So let's see. So you see, this is the message box that appears. So with this information, which is this name here at the top, and then it says please enter currency, and we have one button, which is the OK button, which is amazing. So I have this message box, which is a very basic message box. It just has one button, which is the OK button. And yeah, basically that's what we just saw. And the text currency variable, this field, which is this text box, is then set to be the focus. Okay, so you can, let me click somewhere else. Okay, so let me click in here. For example, you can see the text is not currently the focus. Now let me click on convert. This window pops up. I click OK, and you can see now. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. The focus is on that text field here. So that means I can directly enter a value here. Of course, I can enter non-numbers as of now. And if I try to convert them, and well, let's select stuff here and convert it, you will see our program will crash at that point. That, of course, is not what we wanted. So we will still need to fix that. But now let's look at the rest of the code. So what we check here is the text not empty, and well, then we display please enter a text. Then we check, is the selected value empty or is the index 0, which means that is it this select here? Is our combo box still at select, which means we didn't select anything? If that is the case, then display please select currency form. And then we also say, or we directly focus on the from currency, so the user knows where he needs to select something. So this is a very neat little way to make the application just a little more user-friendly and easier to use. Then we have another else if block here, which says if the selected value for our combo box to currency is null or the index is still 0, which means it's still at select here, then make sure to display this text box here or message box which says please select currency 2. All right, and then we check, is the CMB from currency text and to currency text, so the combo box texts, are they the same? If they are the same, well, then it's pretty simple, because basically there's nothing to convert, right? It will still be the same value, but the LBL currency, which is our label currency.content, will be set to combo box to currency text, empty space, and then the converted value to string N3. So N3 means it is used to place 3 zeros after the dot. So we want to have a precision of 3 values after the decimal point. And then we have this else block. So we took the converted value where we say parse whatever is the result of this calculation here. So let me put that into multiple lines so it's a little more readable here. So like this. So what we're saying is take the selected value that the user used to string from our combo box from currency, multiply that with the text currency text, so whatever the user entered in the text field. So this, maybe it's easier from here actually. So take this text from here, take the currency from here, take the value from the currency that the user used, and take the value from the currency that the user used for the 2, and then do the calculation. So the calculation is the from currency multiplied by the text divided by the to currency. And of course we need to convert it into a string and then make sure that we parse it into a double, and then we do all of the calculations in doubles. And converted value, as you might recall, is this double variable that we created here, which was empty at that point, but then we assign a value to it. And then finally we use the LBL currency and we set the content to be whatever we just calculated. Okay, so we say combo box to currency text, empty space, and then the converted value should be M3. So show the label converted currency and the converted currency name, because we also want to see basically what the currency is that it is converted to. Now if we run this and I convert $25 US to euros, you can see that this actually works already. Okay, so $25 US are 22 euros at the moment of recording, even though it's fluctuating, of course. Okay, so using static values for such an application is not a good idea. You would always want to have the data from the web with the latest currency values. Okay, but that's something that we're going to look at, as I said, in one of the other videos. Okay, so now we just need to make sure that whatever is entered here is actually a number and that this clear button works. Right now, the only thing that it does is it clears this text here, this label here at the top to be empty, but let's extend that a little bit. So what I want to happen when the clear button is clicked, I want to clear controls, and I'm going to create an extra method for this, which I'm going to call clear controls. So what it does is it sets back the text currency, and I need to stop the application running. So I will set back the text currency text to an empty string, and then I check if the currency items count is greater than 0. Then I set the selected index to 0. Why do I do this if statement? Well, if for some reason it is empty, then I don't want to run this code because that would crash the application. So this combo box from currency, if the data source or the item source is empty, which it luckily isn't because we defined it here, and we call this bind currency directly in the main window when the application starts, so it shouldn't create an error in our case. But for some reason, if we forgot to give it a data table as the item source, then that could cause problems. That's why we make sure that the program doesn't crash in such cases. That's what these if statements are for. So we do the same thing here. If items count is greater 0, then set the selected index to be 0. And then we reset the LBL currency content to be an empty string, as well as we set the focus to be on the text currency. So now we can enter the text that we want to have as a value. Okay, so this is clear controls, and we want to run this clear controls whenever we run clear click. Now you could of course say, okay, I could have just used this code and put it into clear click alternatively, but what if I want to reuse this clear controls somewhere else? Well, then it would be nice to have a function for it, and that's why I created this extra function. Okay, and now how do I double check if the value that the user has entered is actually going to be the right value? So that's what this number validation text box method is for. Well, there's this regex thing, so you need to make sure that you import regular expressions here using system.text.regular expressions. So let me go all the way up here. You can see we need this namespace for this to work. And then I'm using a regular expression here. If you want to know more about regular expressions, check out my regular expressions video. And yeah, you can just also read about regular expressions. But basically what I say is I only want to accept numbers. So numbers between 0 and 9, or digits, basically I can enter numbers into that field. And then I say E, which is this text composition event arguments, dot handled should be regex is match e dot text. So we get the text from e, then we match it against our regular expression that we have created here, and then we set it back for e dot handled, which means we only accept numbers now. Okay, so this number validation text, we used it inside of our window or main window.xaml. Let's look at it. So number validation text, where was it? Actually, we can use it in our text amount, our text box here. So you see, we use this property called preview text input, which is super cool, very powerful. And we just use this event number validation text box, which basically previews the text and only allows certain entries, which is very powerful. Because if you want to make sure that the user cannot enter alphanumeric values, but just numbers. So if I try to enter any character here except for numbers, it doesn't accept them anymore. Even commas are not allowed. So I would potentially need to change my regular expression to also allow commas or dots or points for for decimal values. For here, for example, well, I could do that, but I'm going to limit it. Of course, you could also make sure that you limit the amount of entries to the double length that is accepted. So if it's a too long variable, this could also crash our program. So that's something that I didn't take into consideration. So let's crash our program with a way too big number. Well, actually it can handle it. Wow. So you can see it didn't crash, but it didn't take the whole length here. So at one point it stopped. So that's the length that the double can handle. Longer numbers are not really handled well by doubles, but you can see that's just what is generated for us. Now let's click the clear button and you can see it resets everything. So now our application is done, and it took us just a little more than an hour to create this and even explain everything. So now you have this currency converter, and it looks pretty nice, I'd say. You have rounded corners, you have rounded buttons, you have even a gradient in there, you use images, you have labels and a layout, which is fine. Now, of course, it is not perfect. And you can see that very quickly once you resize the application. So you can see it really screws up the application if I change the size of the application. Now, you can stop that by, of course, fixing the min size, for example. You could say the window should never be smaller than size X or Y. So here, for example, you could say min height should be, let's say, 400. And min width should be, let's say, 1000. Okay, so you can, of course, limit your application to have these values. And as it seems, this creates an error. Let me run it again. That's because I broke it. Okay, now let's try it again. And now I cannot make it, yeah, you can see more narrow than this value. And the height, I can go to 400, but I cannot do less. So I can get rid of my logo, which I don't like. I want my logo to be in there. Well, yeah, but that's how you can limit the resize of a window, which is a good idea sometimes. But of course, we could optimize this application to adjust accordingly, but I think it's fine this way. Okay, so that's it for this part. Now, of course, it would be more interesting to have a database, and actually the second part of this 3 video series is going to cover how to add a table, or how to add a database, so to speak, for this application, where you can enter data entries which are currency values, and you can basically on a daily basis use this application to check the internet and then update the currency values, and then basically use the application as it is now, but with correct currency values. And you don't have to go inside of the code to change the values, but you can do it directly inside of your program itself, which is very powerful if you think about it, because understanding how to do this functionality will allow you to create far more complex apps in the future, or programs in the future. Alrighty, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please leave a like. And also, if you haven't subscribed already, then definitely do that. And also hit that notification bell because, as I said at the beginning of the video, this is just part 1 of this series, of this project, so to speak. And in part 2, you are going to see how to create a database or how to use a database in C# and how to basically enter data into that database using a UI that we're also going to build with a grid and all of the good stuff. All right, so if you don't want to miss out, definitely hit those buttons, all of the good ones, and also leave a comment if you have any questions or remarks. All right, so thanks a lot for being with me, and also check out one of those videos. See you there.